Welcome. Nice to have everyone here. Really happy to have Davida Ingram as our artist this morning. She is an artist with a social practice. She's a writer and visual artist who focuses on community and the intersections of race, gender, and queer theory. I'm going to read a little passage from Jen Graves, who's the art critic for The Stranger, after Davida won the Genius Award in 2014. As an artist, Ingram is a social actor. She acts on and with society, reimagining it, searching it, struggling for new forms of agency within it. She does performance art mostly, but really she'll act on or with any material necessary. A bed sheet from a lost relationship, YouTube footage of rampaging elephants, a comedian's cutting words, the sleeping bonnets that some Black women wear to protect their hair overnight, or the grief of heartbroken parents protesting in the street. Her art hopes and trusts and builds. Society deserves worse, but she gives better. She has worked at the Seattle Art Museum and largely in education with the public, Gage Academy of Art, Video, Machete, Insight Arts, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Visitor Center, and she's currently doing public engagement work for Seattle Public Library. And she's co-founder of the Seattle People of Color Salon. She received her BFA from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and an MA at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard. She's one of the contributing artists in the Evergreen exhibition, Sensations That Announce the Future. And she was asked to participate because of the sort of fierce work she does that confronts our past with an unfolding presence. So let's welcome warmly Davida Ingram.
Good morning, everyone. Sweet. How are you all doing? Being in a lecture hall like this on this stage reminds me of 1994 to 1998 because those were the years that I did undergraduate. And I spent 4 years going to sleep in lecture halls just like this one. So, are you all up? All right, thank you. I'll do check-ins with you periodically just to make sure I haven't bored the shit out of you. My name is C. Davida Ingram. You don't have to call me C. I go by Davida. And I entitled this talk Bodies of Knowledge because I'm in the process of looking back. And when I say looking back, I mean in the context of my own human migratory pattern. Um, what has changed about me since I left Chicago in fall of 2003 to go to grad school. And then from grad school, which was in New York, so I went to New York from Chicago. And I ended up in Avondale and Hudson, which is where Bard College is. And it was my first time having a non-urban experience. And I know in our day and time, things like urban can sometimes be code for Black. But for me, moving from Chicago to a small college town, not even quite upstate New York, but going north of New York City, I felt a diminutizing of my world and my worth. And I think that feeling actually followed me to Washington State. And a lot of times in my practice, I talk about what it means to grow up in Black space. So I grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and there are lots of different stories about Chicago. I know Spike Lee made the internet mad because he dropped his satire on Chirac, which is what people call Chicago. And it made me think about really a lot of different things. For one, my first experience with a built environment that changed was when the El Rukin street gang teamed up with Gaddafi and they decided to redo their facade and it became colorful. It had Arabic script and I got a spanking from my mom because we weren't supposed to hang out there. So I think a lot about different bodies of knowledge. what I knew about the built environment as a little girl when something changed in my world, and how I think about built environments because I've run youth programs that allow young people, and especially low income people and youth of color, to think about what it would mean for them to take on their unmade worlds. Now, in my personal experience, because I always tell people to complicate social narratives, my mom is a school teacher, and my dad used to work at the Chicago Board of Trade, so he was working as a commodities broker. Um, but his life kind of fell apart and changed my existence. I went from being kind of someone who is on the road to being like black and bourgeois, which is a very interesting existence because it's tenuous. Middle class black people have a very hard time keeping their children in the middle class. And as my dad's economic status changed, my life changed too. That's nothing new. A lot of families go through that, particularly if there's divorce. So when women change their economies, their children's life feel the impact. So when I talk about bodies of knowledge, I'm just thinking about sliding between worlds. And when I got to Washington State, one of the things that I really started considering, because I've lived here for about 10 years, is this is a place that kind of forces me to think of myself as a racial minority, regardless of if I would like to or not. And I'm just going to start moving into my talk. But this is a still from a piece that I have at the Fry Art Museum. That piece was created to kind of end an epoch of thought for me. When I was in grad school, I made it a persona. I made a persona named Fanon Brown. And Fanon Brown allowed me to escape from some of the things that irritated me in grad school. So, for example, and you'll probably see this as I go through my artist talk, I'm not going to point to a white male, living or dead, who is my big inspiration. A lot of times, what I'm actually going to do is take you back to my places of origins and centers. But in any case, with this particular video, I had an actor named Amontaine Aurora play my fake persona, Fanon Brown. And I also had her play a critic. And in the video, Fanon, who's in she's the one with the really cute twist and the black scoop neck. Fanon is having a conversation with Decca, and Decca is the one with the glasses, the straightened hair, and the blue shirt. And Fanon and Decker are talking about all these different things that Fanon is preoccupied with that are a little bit perverse. And they follow a personal history that I had when I was in grad school, where on one level, I decided to decenter white masculinity in my life, that I would go on Craigslist and invite white men to let me make their favorite meals. And that was me playing with the notion of Bell Hooks' idea of eating the other and kind of fucking with it a little bit and hacking it and saying, what if we eat with one another? What are the different conversations we could have? The talk bodies of knowledge for me kind of is thinking about theoretical realms. And in my 20s, I kind of had a flirtation with post-structuralists. I call it a flirtation because when I think about the book that it feels very elitist and silly to me now. But I was really into Deleuze and Guattari, and I really liked A Thousand Plateaus. And the funny thing about that book is that I think the translation is incredibly opaque. And the older I get, the more interested I am in plain spoken language. But Deleuze ended up writing a book on masochism that fascinated me in grad school. And it fascinated me because I was interested in power plays. I was interested in masochism and I was interested in sadism. And just as a queer person, I think um, I'm of the generation that dealt with the backlash and feminism. So, not to get too tied up tightly. I was very interested in the ways that queers use perverseness as a strategy. So in grad school, in addition to doing Come Hungry, the piece on Craigslist where I made favorite meals, I also offered to be a dom to submissive white men who didn't have money to pay a real dom, because I have a class analysis. Y'all are so sleepy. I'm like making jokes, and y'all are like, okay, where is she going with it? But in any case, in this video, Fanon and Decker are talking about Fanon's art forays, and it's a video that's really acerbic. Later on, I'm going to show you the beginning to that video, which has a very different mood to it. But I just want to lay the ground for later things in the talk that I'm going to bring up, which is that my work is often moving kind of on a knife's edge, where I'm looking at transcendent possibilities, but also looking at sociological realities. So one of the things that I enjoyed about creating Fanon and Deca as a discourse is that I wanted the part of myself that talks back and forth around um, why are you trying these strange what if scenarios and what's the importance of it? In my talk, I often go back to where I come from. So this is a picture of my mom and my dad, and I like kind of pointing back to my parental origins for a couple different reasons. One is that in the narrative of Blackness that we have, it's a very depersonalized narrative, and it's one that oftentimes lacks dimension. And so when I feel like I've lost my own center or my depths, I go back to this picture because it's such an iconic late 1970s picture. I love how fly my mom looks. Like she has the Mary Jane girl beads. She looks really seductive in a way that I really never got a chance to look at her as a little girl. And my dad has the kind of elan that I think we associate with black men. He's sexy. I credit him with my ability to work a room. And I think a lot of times when I think about the narrative of my father, because he got hit by a car when I was in third grade and ended up almost being in a wheelchair, but definitely living with chronic pain and kind of struggling with, things that I think lots of humans struggle with. Whether I think we all have drives and we all have things that we do to make ourselves feel good as humans. So when I say that my dad has tried drugs or maybe has drank a little bit too much, it's really important for me to stop calling him an addict or someone who is who's a crackhead or things like that. So I try and look back at him and see the different skills and resiliencies he's taught me, because I think a lot of my academic and creative success actually comes from his influence. And in a similar sense, I think what I see in my mom is something that comes up in my work a lot, which is how can we look at the Black woman, her figure, her psyche, her emotional states with wonder and curiosity, because I don't think that happens very often in our world. Um, I think a lot about love. This is a picture of me as a little girl, and I'm hanging out with my grandmother. And I often say I do work around social practice, and I am very careful to connect social practice with social justice. And then I problematize it because I think those words are getting cheapened even as they become more popular. So oftentimes when I talk about social justice, I just explain it as love, having a love ethic. And I think I learned a lot of my own love ethic from my grandmother, so I'm pointing towards her. And I also see kind of artists who I'd probably say are kind of my contemporaries doing similar things. I feel when I look at the photos by Latoya Ruby Frazier, if you've seen her images of Braddock and some of the performances she's done with her family, I see that way of paying homage to where we come from. And I see different narratives being possible. When I first got to Seattle in 2008, um, I did a piece called What a Body Can Do. And it was really me starting to consider how I was situating my body in the Pacific Northwest. It was also like a moment for me to kind of figure out what queerness means to me. And oftentimes, like a lot of queer people who maybe don't consistently date someone of the same gender, I don't want to say gender because that's a problematic word, but like date someone who looks like they have um, the same gender identity as you. And when I got to Seattle, even though I've been queer identified since 16, I ended up in 2 long-term relationships with men and a lot of stupid questions around whether I was still queer, which I always found really irritating. So I ended up making this piece, which is a piece where I'm kind of quoting from a piece by Glenn Ligon where he's quoting from Zora Neale Hurston. So I kind of see myself as putting myself in a creative ancestral line with this piece. Um, Oftentimes when I talk about queerness, I like to put it in context. So in my work, I'm revisiting how we make documentary. I'm not a media maker, but oftentimes my projects are encapsulated with video or photography. And so when you're looking at my work, you should also look at the photographers and videographers that I'm hanging out with. I noticed from people smiling that some of you all are reading this text. Um, I've been thinking about what it means to be a queer woman who's moving towards 40. In heteropatriarchy, oftentimes what we tell women is as soon as you get past childbearing age, your value is going to drop tremendously. But we're also in the age of Tinder, and I was having a moment of just thinking, gosh, I could date anybody from 20. I'm not dating anybody who's 20, but like from like 20 to 60. So I had met someone who I was having that thing that happens over text where you're just trying to gauge interest. And I was just getting a lot of text back from this person. And I was like, I don't think he's the same age as me because no one's that loquacious on text. But because a lot of times people have encountered an article about me before they've met me nowadays. So I just said, I'm assuming since it looks like you've Googled me or something, that you know I'm queer, because this was a cisgender guy. And he wrote back, as to being queer, okay, does that mean gay? Sorry if I'm not up to speed on the terminology. My daughter is 30 and she is gay, and I'm helping her through her own crushing heartbreak. Um, and what I wrote back, I'm not going to read the whole text, is queer as in I tried to avoid being a sexual quadroon. Do y'all know what quadroons are? In slave times, they divided people up by their blood. So a mulatto was half white, half black. A quadroon is a quarter, a quarter black, and three-quarters white. Y'all white people work out how y'all were doing the math back then. It's just like either you're human or you're not. But so I try not to be a sexual quadroon, but not quite confused about what a penis looks like. You sound like a good dad. Um, and so in that back and forth, one of the things that I noticed about myself is my interest in bringing history into the conversation, even if it's a quip, but then also kind of helping people to have some complexity in their lived experience. So I'm not really interested in defining what queer is in this exchange, but helping him understand who I am, that I'm going to have these different ways that I'm going to be pressing against what we know. Um, I'm having this thing with my screen where on my version of the screen it's really small and over there it's really big, and I'm not going to look over my shoulder. But in my work, I'm often thinking about the use of Black vernacular. So this is a text thread where someone's bagging on a coworker, and one of the things that comes up is that she's saying that she's going to tell her coworker that she looks like um, a upside down triangle, and then the person who responds on the text is saying, well, when she bends over, she'll become isosceles. And in looking at that particular exchange, one of the things, not to reify like Black language, because I think a lot of times Black people are like decoding Blackness for non-Black people in ways that get really unproductive really fast. But in this particular moment, because I live in Seattle, and this is a text with me and some family members, because I live in Seattle and my family lives in Chicago, I feel like they have a connection to Blackness that is very unself-conscious. And I feel like for me in Seattle, I'm not in Black space as much. So as problematic as the language is, like I realize how long I've lived in Seattle because when I read that thread, I was like, that's so bodyist. I can't believe you said that. That's so bodyist. And I was thinking, in my family, if I had said something like that, they'd be like, sit your ass down and calm down and take it easy. And I'm really interested in that space of people who um, maybe might treat people kindly, but speak in a way that's tough. Because I've learned to ask people to soften their language and to be more inclusionary. And I'm wondering, that certainly doesn't change my Blackness. If you look at the tenets of Black Lives Matter, all the radical imagination of Black Lives Matter is so thoughtful about how it's including everybody. But when I think about everyday folk, the folk of Blackness, there's a very different conversation going on. In my work, rather than kind of talking to, I made that kind of aside around I wasn't going to include a lot of white men, living or dead, in my talk. That's not quite true. This is an amended version of a talk I did at at a recent gathering at Town Hall in Seattle. And one of the things that I did was just gave a shout out to the Black women who've been mentoring me in Seattle. And when I say they've been mentoring me, I just mean that they're older women with incredible wisdom and experience who share their time with me. So in Seattle, I try and make sure that people know about women like Karen Turing. I know Karen because of her work in media activism, and my work is very inflected by media activism. I learned how to be a producer from working with media activists. And then I also called out some of the women who've been the leaders in the performing arts in Seattle. So they normally are doing invisibilized work, but work that I find really important and work that I've benefited from just culturally. So I call out Vivian Phillips and Barbara Earl Thomas, for example, for the work that they've been doing to change the cultural landscape of Seattle. So Vivian, for example, has been working with other leaders in the Black community to get a Black cultural district established in Seattle's Central District. With the housing covenants that used to exist in Seattle, if you were Black, that was the only place you could live. And now with gentrification, that neighborhood has changed dramatically. So most of the Black families that used to live there now live in the suburbs of Seattle. Now, I have a friend who does work with people in big data. And one of the things that people in big data do is they just do roll ups of numbers. So when I said that Black people have moved out of the Central District in Seattle, you might go, people move all the time. But one of the things that I found out as a metric for Seattle is that when you live inside the city, you have access to about $300 of public benefit dollars. And then when you're pushed beyond Seattle, that number drops to 30. So when we talk about inequity, it's actually really important to be able to kind of draw out what we mean when we say there's inequity. So yes, people move all the time, but if people are moved into places where they're going to have a chronic lack of opportunity, it's important to understand how those flows work. And my mentors helped me do that. Which leads me to my project from last year, I Wish a Mother Would. That's the G version of the title. I did it at a historic house museum in Seattle called the James and Janie Washington Museum, a house museum. And their board director was a pastor. And I couldn't tell her the real title of the piece because she would never have let me use it because it was called I Wish a Motherfucker Would. And my people are religious people, so I just couldn't sit next to a reverend and be like, yeah, I'm going to do this piece called I Wish a Motherfucker Would on a Sunday at your historic house museum. So the title got shortened to I Wish a Mother Would. And what that piece was an archive. So one of the things, and you're going to see this woman's face again later on, um, what that piece was an archive where I went out into the community and kind of borrowed from the vernacular of social media and asked people to pose with signs that started with "I wish a mother." Because when I was growing up, if someone was like fucking with you, you would always like you'd be like, "I wish a motherfucker would do this, that, and the third." And I was like, "Well, what do we really wish would happen in our world? What are some things that we really want?" So we did photos like this one that you're looking at. I wish a mother would tell me what I can't read everything, but I should be offended by. I wish a motherfucker would let her light shine. These are some of the messages that came out of that project. But we also, because when I say we, a lot of times when I do projects, I work with teams. And I worked with three really great sound engineers who took oral histories as well. And some of the stories that came out were ones like the one that I'll share with you. There was a woman who talked about being sexually assaulted, but because she believed in transformative justice, that she said she didn't want the person who assaulted her to be discarded, but she did want them to heal. And as I think about being on a college campus, I hope you all are having really cogent conversations about sexual assault because they happen all too often in every single arena, but especially on colleges. I think we have an opportunity to talk about it with great care. But to hear someone say, I know that all that the humans can do monstrous things, but if that's the case, just to borrow from American Horror Story, shout out to my girlfriend Brenna who loves American Horror Story. There's a quote that says, all monsters are human. So there's something about the stories that we collected during I Wish a Mother Would that pointed to deep humanity. I got a chance to show that project at the Northwest African American Museum this fall. In terms of I Wish a Mother Would, just so you kind of understood what it was like as a performance, this is a slide of the 90-minute durational tableau vivant that we did in James Washington Jr.'s studio in Seattle. I mentioned that this was a historic house museum. I just want to back up and say if you look directly underneath the chandelier in that image, what you're seeing is a portrait of James Washington Jr. He's one of the first well-known Black sculptors in the Pacific Northwest. He was also a contemporary of Jacob Lawrence. Now, a few weeks ago, we had a celebration of the new Lawrence Fellows at the Seattle Art Museum. And one of the things that the curator, Sandra Jackson Dumont, did was kind of point out that Jacob Lawrence was a philanthropist. In a similar vein, when I look at James Washington Jr., one of the things that I can totally account for is his vision for the future. So this is a man who was born really, really poor in the South, who ended up migrating to Washington and deciding that he was going to work in stone. And he left $500,000 for posterity. So for artists to come to his home and to use his studio that he built out of his home as a residency. When I first learned about Dr. Washington, there was something about his story that really took me, and I still claim him almost like as a creative godfather in a way. So it was really important for me to do I Wish a Mother Would at the James Washington Jr. Foundation, because I like to point back to kind of sacred spaces in my work, and also in this particular case for a space that struggles. So when I first heard about them, I ended up going to check out the studio, and it still had the electrical outlets that Dr. Washington had put in with an electrician. And if you ran any power tools, you would blow out the circuits. So I ended up writing a grant to For Culture in Seattle and getting $17,000 to get the studio rewired. And when I got money to do my performance, I knew I wanted it to be in that space. So as you're looking in the picture, definitely check out the black and white of James Washington Jr. But in the foreground, you'll see the bases, Evan Flory Barnes, Seattle performance artist extraordinaire, Rachel Ferguson. She was that first image that you saw in the black and whites with the signs. I'm a little bit of a control freak, so rather than have the event documentation be the only way that people can understand my performances, I tend to work with a photographer in advance to stage a photo shoot. So in this case, this is me kind of starting to get closer to something that I've been working on more deeply over the last 12 months. And that's a way of recentering the Black female body and placing her in a larger, broader context. So in this image, Rachel Ferguson is posing with another artist friend of mine named Megumi Shauna Arai. Megumi is a really talented photographer in her own right. And in my work in Seattle, I'm hoping what I'm doing is vivifying what Seattle life as an artist is like for me. When I went to grad school, I really loved learning about happenings and thinking about different artists from different disciplines making a fertile ground for creativity. And I feel like I kind of want to leave that same sort of legacy in my own work. Again, in the same photo shoot for my wish, I wanted to go with a dream landscape. So as you look at the four figures that are in this particular photo, on the ground is a woman who in her daytime life is a landscaper. Her name is Leda Swedan, but she also is an activist for Palestine. Um, as you move up, the two female figures that you see on the table, closest to the big pile of cotton is Lucy Minda Carpenter, also known as Lulu. Lulu is a cultural worker who does organizing across a lot of different sectors for queer liberation, for people of color liberation, and I think she really works to bridge multiple worlds as a queer woman of color. Again, right next to Lulu is Rachel Ferguson. I love with that shot that I did with Zorn B. Taylor. That's the photographer that I'm collaborating with. Rachel almost looks like she's like a fairy. It looks like there's a ball of fire coming out of her fingertips. And I was going for high magic in that scene, so that being able to capture that image really delighted me. Next to in the foreground on the base is Evan Flory Barnes. Evan is a musician in industrial revelation, but also an incredible spiritualist. So again, in my images, what I'm hoping to do is help people understand who are some of the folks that are making my life come alive in Seattle. Backing up a little bit, in my work, I often have kind of quieter moments that are not about seeing people move around, or even the tableau vivant. It's more thinking about images that just live in my head as an artist. And oftentimes they go back to things that remind me of text. Um, During I Wish Your Mother Would, I had an installation in the kitchen of the James Washington Jr. house that was inspired by a story in The Conjure Woman. That's an anthology by Charles Chestnut. And in The Conjure Woman, there's a story of a slave who has an incredibly sadistic slave master. And the slave goes to visit the Conjure Woman, and she gives him a magical sweet potato. And the sweet potato, just to make the story short, changes the master into a slave. And the master then actually isn't able to function like the other slaves. So in the story, the slave that originally went to the Conjure Woman is complaining about the master, but also his overseer. And the overseer is just as cruel as the master. So when the master who has become a slave shows up as the new nigger, quote unquote, on the plantation, the overseer spends all his time trying to break the new slave because he doesn't know all the ways of being subjugated. I was fascinated by that story because we're kind of entering the era of empathy. And I found that the story was both empathetic but also problematic because at the end of the story, the conjure woman can't move against her sociological reality. She actually has to provide the slave who came to visit her originally with a potato that changes the master back into a slave, or the master from a slave back into his original self. And as a contemporary person who's interested in conjuring new realities, I wonder what it would look like if we do not allow, in my case, when I think about it, just dominance to to move from thinking in concert with the oppressed back to dominance again. So this pile of sweet potatoes that was part of the installation was rather opaque. And as I was thinking about my talk, I was thinking, how can you move in a space of generosity so people can understand your visual language? Because a lot of times outside of that context, people would be left to their own to understand why I have certain things included in my visual fields. I'm going to show you the opening sequence of the video that I mentioned earlier with Fanon and Decca. And we're going to watch it as the figure that's standing on the roof moves from the roof into an interior view, and you get to see her join other women. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of my ideas there. And I'll do a time check too. How am I doing for time? Okay, we're good. Okay. So I'm going to move us along to the next image. Before I completely move out of the context for this video, if you wanted to see the whole thing together, the whole 20-minute video, it's currently being shown in Seattle at the Fry Art Museum as part of the Genius exhibition. And it's a convening of all the artists that have won the Genius Award since the time that the award started. I always laugh. I always want people to think about the ironic gesture that the stranger was doing when they said that they were coming up with the Genius Award. The stranger is a stranger. The stranger is a local paper in Seattle, and I think they were making it like a ironic aside to the MacArthur Genius Award that goes out. That's a significantly larger award. But I always feel doubled when I say that I won that award because I think genius is um, it's such a hard title to earn, and I don't see myself as such. But I often talk about Black brilliance in my work. So if you notice in that particular video that we were looking at, I have my eyes on the Black female figure. And I was really intentional around picking darker skinned Black women for the videos, or the videos and the photos that I work on for my projects, because I believe in broadening out the conversation about beauty. And I was trained as a figure drawer, and I always think like at the end of my life, I'll probably go back to paper and pencil. But for right now, I feel like what I'm doing is taking some of the things I know about composition and applying it to a broader plane, and almost being able to work like an orchestra director. So in that video that you saw of the woman going up the stairs, I got a chance to work with a drone operator. So the aerial footage that you saw at the beginning, that's not me flying the drone. It's a really cool young guy that I met named EXO, who just loves drones and had saved up to buy like this $3,000 drone and could fly it inside of King Street Station and not hit us or the building, which was really important for me. But when I think about that notion of genius and the conversation that I often have about Black brilliance, one of the things that comes up for me is that Black people had to be creative to survive in a racist society. And in the imagery that I'm trying to make is to leave space for wonder and grandeur. So I laugh when I look at that image because there was a miscommunication during the production, and I thought I had clearance to do the shoot, which was pretty critical because I was using a drone. And I ended up kind of having this encounter with a security guard who said, "Well, we're glad you stopped shooting because we almost called the cops." And I said, "I'm glad you didn't, since cops have been killing people left and right." And so the story of that exchange took a larger life, and I ended up having this email exchange with the person who was in charge of the space that gave me access, where they asked me to give them back my footage because they thought that I had done a protest on the top of King Street Station. And I was like, that would be the most opaque protest ever. Like Black women in beekeeper veils with no signage. Like, what kind of fucked up activist do you think? Like, if I'm gonna do a protest on King Street Station, everybody's gonna fucking know about it. Um, but I was laughing because I was like, wow, even though I thought that this piece was a departure from my pugilism, my need to kind of fight for justice, I found that the fight came to me, and it reminded me in a really good way that I don't fight because I want to. I fight because it's necessary. It's needed, even under opaque circumstances. So when I look at those Black female figures looking over King Street Station, the kind of opposite of dominion that they have, because I see their quiet authority and their beauty and their way of presiding. And I like leaving people with these images that speak to the broader unconscious, because I am a writer, but I think we've been getting tangled up in our words in social justice parlance. So I'd much rather give you an image that serves as a corrective sometimes. That said, one of the reasons why I went about doing the King Street Station video, and that video is part of a project that I just call Avatar, Fanon, and Decca. But I ended up looking for grandeur after doing another piece that was like pretty close together, and these all happened this year. That piece was called Where Can My Black Ass Go to Be Safe? A portion of it is being displayed here at Evergreen. And within it, as you probably have started to see, a lot of my work is asking people to do something with me. And in this case, I asked 14 friends of mine to come over to my house and take a portrait of me bent over. And after they took a picture of me in the prone position, I asked them to answer the question, where can a Black woman go to be safe? Now, in my head, I actually thought the first part would be the awkward part, because it's kind of weird to ask your friends to take a picture of your ass. I'm just saying, like y'all were really calm about it. Like that's just normal. That's just what artists do. But I found the second question, asking where can a Black woman go to be safe, was the more awkward thing, and that a lot of my friends were scared to answer the question. Um, in most cases, the answer was nowhere. And I ended up with these expository texts that said a lot to me. And I intentionally had a mixed race crew. So I had Asian men, I had Black men, I had Black women, I had white women, a really, really interesting mix of people. And it was primarily the Black women who were able to imagine a way that we can be safe. And I think, as strictly as I tell people to avoid essentialism, I also think the importance of essentialism is that oftentimes, if you experience the problem, you know it best. So when I tell people, when we do social justice work, nothing about us without us, is because I think it's actually people who are most affected by injustice who can have the optimism that it can change. So in that piece, we go through a polyphonic exchange. I often have to explain that to people because otherwise, if I don't, I'm credited with all the things that come out of the piece. But in chiefly what I was curious about with that particular piece was, how does an object change with the gaze? So it always fascinated me, in the same way with um, Fanon and Decca, that people don't realize that the subject is the same. It's just the gaze that is changing. So lots of people have gone, well, how many people post for where can my Black ass go to be safe? And I'm like, my Black ass? Also, please don't talk to me about my Black ass in the Q&A. I won't like it. I always talk about, like, sometimes when people speak, like, I might say nigger. If you're not Black, I don't want to share that word with you. So I always say that in mixed settings because it just sets an appropriate boundary. But when people go, whose ass is that? I have to say it's mine. The ass didn't change. The shooters changed. But my goal with that project was to get to notions of safety, because I think we ask Black women to just live with the constant notion that we could never be safe. I will admit that I did this piece right after Sandra Bland was found dead in Texas. And I hate when my art feels like I'm becoming like an ambulance chaser for social justice. I don't want that for my practice. But I did want that space of wondering, what is the psychological place that I'm inhabiting when I'm witnessing horror? On a lighter note, um, asses are on my mind often. This is a piece of mine called "The Democracy of Assholes," and that's the pomo homo in me, the postmodern homosexual in me, even though I'm queer, who wonders if we couldn't look at the anus as a site of unification. It's taboo. Richard Fung, when he was talking about gay porn, said, one of the things that is an issue with anal sex, and I'm talking about consensual anal sex, is that it's the thing that happens to you once you've done something bad. It's punishment. And I like thinking about, like, what would a renewed discourse around the anus look like, because I think we're kind of over fascinated with genital difference. Sometimes I look at junk and wonder how we are fascinated with sex at all, because the genitals look funny to me. They're just, like, literally kind of funny to me. So I was just like, I feel like assholes are a little bit more elegant, as long as they're clean. Um, which leads me to this slide. A lot of times in my work, I'm often thinking about, like, dream space. And probably because I look at nightmares a lot. Like, I remember doing my grad work, and I'd done work on images that Black people have to consume that are related to HIV. And I'm thinking about, like, Charlie Sheen revealing that he's HIV positive. And I was born in 1976, so I remember when Rock Hudson, who was like a famous star that I didn't know when I was 7, but everybody knew who he was. When Rock Hudson came out as having full-blown AIDS, that really left a big impact on me as a little girl. And HIV has been like a bugaboo that like thought about consistently for many, many years. So it was really huge for me to listen to Charlie Sheen mention that he's HIV positive and have someone step up and advocate for him, talk about the fact that it's highly unlikely that he would have passed on HIV to someone else. We live in the era where people can take Truvada and have unprotected sex. It won't protect you against herpes and other things. And that's not a big deal because I think herpes is just like a very is just an average part of life. So as radical sexual beings, I'd like for us to think about in sex, we have these different things we get scared about. I'm going to come back to this image in a second. But like just thinking about that arc of how did we get to Charlie Sheen? And will there ever be a Black woman who could step forward as a famous person and say she's HIV positive and that not be her whole narrative? Because then I think we'd have a space of sexual liberation that would be really precise and exact. Which leads me back to this image in my conversation around me being a dreamer. Um, because Seattle just doesn't have as many Black people as Chicago, I look to Facebook for my conversations with Blackness. And back in like 2012, 2013, there was a ratcheting up of conversations about ratchetness. Just like for me, working class Black people, people talk about like ratchet culture. And one part of it was I noticed friends of mine who were constantly bagging on Black women who wore their hair bonnets out in public. And just as a feminist, I had to take a moment and say, shut the fuck up. And this is why. Um, in a society where where we've decided that if you are straight, haired, blonde, and blue eyed, you're the epitome of beauty, who am I to tell someone who's straightening her hair, don't do the thing that's actually going to protect your hair so you can keep the length? Because everybody wants you to have long, straight hair. It's not just enough to have straight hair. Oftentimes we want it to be long. And so I started thinking about Black women who are assailed because of trying to live up to beauty standards and also because they can never live up to beauty standards. So I decided that I wanted to, again, working with Zorn B. Taylor, he's a photographer that I really adore collaborating with, working with Zorn to set up this image where I am posing as my soul and looking at a woman who's kind of approximate to me because I find in Seattle, as long as you're short and dark skinned, somebody might call you Davida. And so I was like, you're like near enough to me that you could probably be me in a white supremacist context because people aren't looking closely. So kind of pretend to be me and wear this hair bonnet. But when we were working out the image, the things that I knew I wanted was a very iconic, um, classically feminine version of a Black female womanhood on display, but with the head bonnet. And that series was called Conjures and the Mermaid. And during that time, I think I was thinking a lot about how to sit with soul, is how I've described it before, because it was just a time when I was going through a really devastating breakup. And I felt really separated from myself. So I wanted to be able to look at myself with wonder again and to kind of imbue in that space some space of sanctity to my corporal being. So being able to pose as my soul looking at an avatar of myself and to kind of like calm down and have a different headspace that was protected and treasured inside that Black satin bonnet. My work often deals with dreaming. You saw Layla earlier in the image. This is her in the installation of I Wish a Mother Would, dreaming in a greenhouse. The way I designed that performance was that in order for you to get a chance to be in the presence of Layla, you had to greet her with a song. So Layla was accompanied by a custodian who watched over her. When we were talking about setting up the scene, Layla wanted to feel safe. We also had a really interesting dialogue because she was wondering if I had separated her out because she wasn't darker skinned. Because a lot of times I work in my pieces with ensembles that are multiracial, but predominantly people of color. And I love that she asked me that question because I think that essentialism works until it doesn't. And so I had to explain to her that the reason why she was in the greenhouse was not because she was lighter skinned. It was pointing back to her work with the land and that because she's someone who works as a in landscaping, and I've watched her transform the space of the James Washington Jr. House. I wanted her to hang out in the place that he acclaimed because he was a champion Rosarian. But I love that space of activist politics where we tease out deeper meanings. So I love that she took a risk with me to ask what my intention was. So also I could reveal what the intention was, and hopefully in a way that allayed her fears that in my celebration of Blackness, that that's where my buck stops. And I had to remind her that I see us as working in solidarity, that it made sense to me that when we were going through Ferguson, that Palestine was showing their Black Lives Matter um, signs in solidarity. So I'm often hoping in our politics, as we think about being radical and bold, that we're also always thinking about how we can connect and bridge worlds. Um, and this particular video, well, this still, I was part of a group of folks that got together to skywrite Black Lives Matter over the Space Needle. We still have to finish up this project because we haven't figured out exactly where we want it to land. I think this is the first public gathering where I've talked about it, but I put it in the slide deck because I was thinking about the gesture of grandeur, and also the ways that my documentary practice is always subtle. So there's an artist named D.K. Pan who had commissioned a skywriter to write "Time is Memory," and then DK reached out to me and said, "Hey, Davida, do you want to skywrite Black Lives Matter?" And I was like, "I do." Like, what would I have to do to make that happen? And he was like, well, you have to raise $2,000. And at the time, I needed to do it in like in 3 days. And I was like, oh, this kind of sucks because I was trying to finish the video of Fanon and Decca for my show at the Fry. And it was that classic thing that happens to artists where like you really need to finish your deadline and then some other shit that you can't say no to comes up. So I sent a text out to 30 people that I knew and said, hey, we have an opportunity to skywrite Black Lives Matter. If you support it, like we can make it happen. And I given myself 24 hours, but actually all of the money came in plus an additional amount within 8 hours. So that's how we were able to get Black Lives Matter written above the Space Needle. And I like thinking about that moment. One, because I am part of a group that's fundraising for Black-led organizing for liberation. And we're trying to raise $75,000. So if you all want to help out, please give to the Social Justice Fund Northwest. I think right now is a moment where the level of anti-Black violence in the US has some interesting opportunities. We have opportunities, if you're interested in the prison industrial complex, to think about why there's such astronomical disproportionate numbers for Black people in our prisons, but also to rethink the carceral society in America. Um, America is the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we lead in the amount of people that we incarcerate. So I think as we move forward with Black Lives Matter, we get to be specific, but we also get to make some broader changes that I think are really needed. So I do want to encourage people to give to the Social Justice Fund's Momentum Giving Project, because this little slice of life right there, looking at Black Lives Matter, and as soon as we put it up, you could barely see matter. It started disappearing. And so I'm really interested in that notion of seizing the moment so that we can actually change time, whether it's stopping the terroristic reign against Black people in the US, or even thinking about our environmental collapse. I'm hoping that we are thinking that we're moving in a space of urgency. Thank you.